Los Angeles's dark, strange history of trick-or-treat murders. Halloween. A night when shadows stretch a little longer, when the air feels a little colder, when the streets, filled with laughter and candy-filled bags, hide something much darker beneath the surface. It's a night of masks. A night when the strange and the terrifying blend into the ordinary. When the person knocking on your door might not just be a child looking for candy, but something else entirely. Because in Los Angeles, Halloween has never just been about costumes and fun. It has been a night of horror. Of blood. Of doors that should have never been opened. Imagine this dash. It's late. The streets are nearly empty now. The last few trick-or-treaters have gone home, their pillowcases filled with candy, their faces tired from excitement. But then, there's a knock at the door. It's quiet. Almost hesitant. A single tap, tap, tap. You open it, expecting to see a child in a flimsy costume, eyes wide with excitement. But instead, you see something else. A mask. Staring at you. Expressionless. Hollow. And before you can react, dash. A gunshot. A body collapses. The night air, once filled with laughter, is now silent. The candy spills across the floor, mixing with something darker, something warm, something red. This isn't just a ghost story. This isn't some urban legend whispered around a campfire. This is real. 3 brutal murders. 3 Halloweens soaked in blood. And a truth far more terrifying than anything you'll see in a horror movie. Because in Los Angeles, the city of dreams and nightmares, sometimes, the real monsters don't wear costumes. They knock on your door. And when you answer, it's already too late. Act 1, The Murder at Van Nuys, 1966. Halloween night. A time for laughter, for music, for the thrill of being someone or something else, even if just for one night. Costumes conceal identities, masks hide expressions, and for a few hours, the world feels different. A little wilder. A little freer. But sometimes, a mask isn't needed to stand out. At a Halloween party in Van Nuys, 1966, the air buzzed with excitement. Nearly 100 guests filled the house, the energy infectious. Skeletons, witches, vampires, and monsters danced beneath the dim glow of flickering lights. Music pulsed through the walls, and the unmistakable scent of cigarettes and cheap liquor clung to the air. Amidst the sea of elaborate costumes and painted faces, one man caught attention not because of what he wore, but because he wasn't wearing anything special at all. Kenneth A. Lindstrand. 32 years old. A directory publisher, dressed in plain clothes, moving through a world of masks and disguises. And maybe just maybe that made him too easy to spot. It was just after 1 a.m. when Lindstrand arrived. He wasn't part of the original guest list, but that didn't matter. Halloween parties are fluid, chaotic. People show up, people leave, new faces blend into the crowd. No one questions it. That's part of the fun. He grabbed a drink. He danced. He smiled. And in that moment, he was just another reveler, lost in the music, the energy, the carefree thrill of the night. Then, another man walked in. Unlike the others, he too was without a costume. No mask. No disguise. And when his eyes locked onto Lindstrand, the atmosphere seemed to shift. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the rest of the party. A flicker of tension in the air. A glance held a second too long. A stiffness in Lindstrand's posture, as if something inside him recognized danger before his mind could catch up. Words were exchanged. No one remembers exactly what was said. Maybe it was a challenge. Maybe it was a warning. But whatever it was, it sent a clear message. Run. Lindstrand turned, bolting toward the house, pushing through the crowd, weaving between dancing bodies. His breath came fast, his pulse hammering in his ears. He needed to get away. But in a house full of people, there was nowhere to go. Then dash. A gunshot. For a split second, no one reacted. It was Halloween, after all. A night of tricks. A night of pranks. The sound of a gunshot? That could have been part of the fun, just another theatrical effect in the grand spectacle of the night. Someone even laughed. And then, a woman in a hula skirt danced over Lindstrand's collapsed body, grinning. "This will wake him up," she joked, swaying her hips to the rhythm of the music. Then, she saw the blood. And she screamed. Panic erupted. Music was cut off mid-beat. Conversation stopped. The air, once alive with excitement, now crackled with fear. Guests scrambled, backing away, their costumes suddenly feeling absurd in the face of something real. Something raw. Kenneth Lindstrand lay motionless on the floor, his breath ragged, his hand twitching slightly before falling still. The party had come to a screeching halt. Someone called for help. But it was too late. By the time the police arrived, Lindstrand was gone. Dead, in the middle of a crowded house, surrounded by people who just moments before had been laughing and drinking. And yet, not a single person had stopped it. For years, the case remained unsolved. The party had been filled with witnesses, yet the chaos, the music, the masks, it all blurred together. No one had seen the killer clearly enough to name him. But secrets have a way of surfacing. And 3 years later, in 1969, the truth began to unravel. Kenneth Lindstrand hadn't just been another party guest. He wasn't a random victim. And his death? It hadn't been a crime of passion or a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. Lindstrand had been a man of means. Over $100,000 sat in safety deposit boxes in his name, a fortune, especially for the time. And jealousy, that ancient, venomous monster, had been lurking in the shadows that night. The police arrested 3 men. Among them, Jack Gentry Stearns, a 35-year-old car salesman. His motive? A woman. Maria Stearns. 22 years old. And the one person at the party Jack couldn't take his eyes off of. Because for just a few minutes, Kenneth Lindstrand had danced with her. And in Jack's mind, that was enough. When the case finally made it to trial, the evidence was clear. Witnesses came forward, piecing together what had happened that night: the tension, the confrontation, the moment Lindstrand tried to escape before the fatal shot rang out. Jack Gentry Stearns was sentenced to life in prison. But some ghosts don't fade so easily. The house where the party was held still stands today. The music is long gone. The laughter has faded into memory. But those who were there that night, those who witnessed the moment the party turned to tragedy, they say the echoes remain. They remember the way the energy shifted. The way the air grew thick. The way a night of celebration turned into something darker. And even now, decades later, those who were there can still hear it. The music. The laughter. And then, the silence. Act 2, The Chinatown Trick-or-Treat Murders, 1974. Halloween is supposed to be a night of laughter, of mystery, of innocent mischief. A night where children roam the streets in costumes, their small hands clutching bags of candy, their voices filled with excitement. A night where the biggest worry should be how much chocolate they can collect before bedtime. But in Los Angeles, Halloween has a darker side. A side where masks don't just hide identities, they conceal intent. Where the knock at the door isn't always from children asking for candy. And where sometimes, the monsters are real. On October 31, 1974, in the heart of Chinatown, the streets were alive with the spirit of the holiday. Families decorated their homes. Jack-o'-lanterns flickered on porches. The smell of roasted pork and dumplings drifted through the cool night air. It was a Halloween like any other. until a single knock at a door changed everything. At 9 p.m., 71-year-old Mrs. Lowe heard the sound at her front door. It was late, but not too late for trick-or-treaters. She shuffled toward the door, her small frame barely reaching the handle. She expected children wide-eyed, excited, wearing plastic masks of superheroes or ghosts, holding out their bags for candy. But when she opened the door, the figures standing outside were not children. Two of them wore masks. One, a wolf man. The other, Frankenstein. Behind them, a third figure stood in the shadows, his face obscured by the dim porch light. At first, there was a moment of hesitation. A strange stillness. A feeling that something was off. Then a gun. Raised. Pointed directly at her. Before she could scream, before she could even process what was happening, they pushed their way inside. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. Her eyesight was weak, but she could tell they were young. Too young to be carrying weapons. Too young to be doing something like this. Chaos erupted inside the house. Furniture was overturned. Cabinets ripped open. The sound of drawers being yanked from their slots, the contents spilling onto the floor. They wanted something. But what? Mrs. Lowe had nothing of real value. No jewelry. No cash hidden away. And yet, they kept searching, their hands quick, their movements frantic, as if time were running out. And then, from the back of the house a shuffle. A voice. Her husband, 81-year-old Pak Sui Lowe, stepped out of the bedroom. Nearly blind, frail with age, unaware of what was happening. He didn't understand the chaos. The figures in masks. The guns in their hands. Maybe he thought they were just children playing a prank. Maybe he thought it was all a mistake. But the gunman didn't hesitate. A single shot rang out. The bullet slammed into his chest. He staggered, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. His knees buckled. And then he collapsed. The moment stretched, thick with horror. The invaders stood frozen, staring at what they had done. This wasn't the plan. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. And then panic. They turned. They ran. Through the front door, down the darkened street, disappearing into the night. They left behind no stolen goods. No valuables. Only their masks. And a bag of Halloween candy. The bag half full was the strangest detail of all. It meant only one thing, they had actually been out trick-or-treating earlier that night. It had started as a normal Halloween for them. And yet, somehow, it had ended in murder. The case confounded the police. Who would target an elderly couple in their own home? The crime felt senseless, random. Mrs. Lowe, heartbroken, described her attackers as shorter than she was, and she stood barely over 5 feet tall. That meant they were likely teenagers. Maybe even younger. But beyond that, there were no leads. No suspects. The fingerprints on the masks led nowhere. And for months, the case went cold. And then, 4 months later, in February of 1975, everything changed. The police weren't investigating the Lowe murder anymore. They had been called to something else, another crime. Another act of violence. But this time, the victim had survived. His name was Chan Wing Wong. He was 20 years old. And he had just escaped something terrifying. He had been kidnapped, beaten, robbed, driven out to San Bernardino by a group of young men who told him exactly what they planned to do. They were going to kill him. And they were going to bury him in Cajon Pass. But Wong fought back. He managed to untie his hands, to slip from his captor's grip. And then he ran. Bullets whizzed past him as he tore through the darkened forest. He ran for hours, his breath ragged, his heart hammering in his chest, until finally he saw headlights. A highway. A chance at survival. He flagged down a passing car. And he told his story. The police moved fast. The suspects, 3 of them were arrested. 2 were just 15 years old. The third, a 20-year-old named Stephen Wei Chung Ho. And when the questioning began, the truth unraveled like a thread pulled from a fraying sweater. One of the teenagers cracked. He confessed. He and his friend had done more than kidnap Wang. More than rob him. More than try to kill him. They were also the ones who had killed Pak Sui Lo on Halloween night. The Chinatown trick-or-treat murders had finally been solved. But the answer raised more questions than it answered. Why? Why had they chosen that house? Why had they gone inside? What were they looking for? Even the confessed killers couldn't fully explain it. The night had started like any other Halloween. They had collected candy, walked the streets like countless other kids. And then, something had shifted. Something had snapped. And they had found themselves standing on a stranger's doorstep, holding guns in hands that should have only been holding trick-or-treat bags. A night that had begun with laughter had ended in blood. And in the aftermath, one terrifying truth remained. Sometimes, the scariest masks aren't the ones made of plastic. Sometimes, the real monsters are the ones hiding in plain sight. Act 3, The Salon Owner's Murder, 1957. Halloween night. A time for masks, for shadows, for the unknown. But sometimes, the most terrifying things aren't the ones lurking in the darkness, they are the ones standing right in front of you. 1957 Sun Valley, Los Angeles. The streets were quiet now, the night winding down. The last of the trick-or-treaters had gone home, their pillowcases heavy with candy. Porch lights flickered off one by one, signaling that the fun was over. But at one particular house, one final knock would change everything. Peter Fabiano, a 35-year-old beauty salon owner, stood at the front door of his home, a bowl of leftover candy in his hands. He was tired. It had been a long day, and all he wanted was to lock up and go to bed. Then, a knock. Slow. Deliberate. Almost hesitant. Peter sighed. It was late for this. But Halloween had a way of bringing out the stragglers, teenagers looking for one last score of candy, pranksters hoping for a reaction. He opened the door, expecting to see a grinning child in a cheap mask, a hand already reaching for his bowl. But what he saw instead made him pause. A figure stood before him. Dressed in blue jeans, a khaki jacket, red gloves, and a mask. The eyes behind it were unreadable. The stance, too still. Something about the silence, the way the figure just stood there, sent a ripple of unease crawling up Peter's spine. He frowned. It's a little late for this, isn't it? Then dash. A deafening crack. A flash of fire from the paper bag clutched in the figure's hands. The shot hit him square in the chest. Peter stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat, his legs giving out beneath him. The candy bowl slipped from his grasp, hitting the ground with a dull clatter. Wrapped sweets scattered across the doorstep, mixing with the deep, dark stain spreading beneath him. The masked figure didn't hesitate. Didn't gloat. Didn't linger. They turned. And they vanished into the night. Inside, Peter's wife, Betty, heard the sound, the dull thud of his body hitting the ground, the unnatural silence that followed. Her heart lurched. She ran to the door. And then, she saw him. Her husband. Slumped against the doorway. His eyes wide with shock, his lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't. Blood soaked through his shirt, seeping into the cracks of the pavement beneath him. She screamed. Neighbors rushed from their homes. Someone called for help. But it was too late. Peter Fabiano was gone before the ambulance even arrived. The investigation began immediately, but the murder felt strange. It wasn't a robbery, nothing was stolen. It wasn't random, this was execution style. The police scoured Peter's history, searching for enemies. A bad business deal? A grudge? A crime of passion? Nothing seemed to fit. But the way the shooter had acted, calm, methodical, suggested something deeper. This wasn't just a killing. This was personal. For months, the case went cold. Leads dried up. The killer had left behind no evidence, no fingerprints, nothing but an eerie, empty mask. It seemed like the perfect crime. Until someone talked. An anonymous tip led detectives to a storage locker. Inside, they found the gun used in the murder, carefully hidden away. And from there, the truth unraveled. The shooter wasn't some hardened criminal. It wasn't a gangster or a hitman. It was a woman. A quiet, unassuming medical clerk named Goldine Pizzer. And she hadn't acted alone. She had been manipulated, twisted, pulled into something dark by someone even more dangerous. A woman named Joan Rabel. Joan Rabel was a photographer. A former employee at Peter Fabiano's salon. And she had a connection to Betty Fabiano, one that went beyond friendship. Joan and Betty had been close. Too close. When Betty and Peter's marriage hit a rough patch, she had stayed with Joan for a time. The two grew attached. But eventually, Peter demanded she end the relationship. He wanted his wife back. And he got his way. Betty chose her husband. And Joan chose revenge. But she didn't want to pull the trigger herself. She needed someone else. Someone vulnerable. Someone she could mold into a weapon. That someone was Goldine Pizzer. Pizzer, recently divorced, struggling with her identity, was desperate for love. And Joan knew exactly how to play her. She filled Goldine's head with lies. Told her that Peter was a vile, evil man. That he deserved to die. That this wasn't murder, it was justice. And Goldine? She believed her. So, on Halloween night, she did what Joan told her to do. She put on a mask. She took the gun. She knocked on Peter Fabiano's door. And she pulled the trigger. When the police arrested Goldine Pizzer, she didn't fight it. She didn't even seem surprised. Instead, she let out a breath and said, "It's a relief to get it off my mind." She confessed everything. How Joan had manipulated her. How they had visited the salon together to observe Peter, to make sure she knew his face. How Joan had told her, the night of the murder, to forget she ever knew her. But it was too late for forgetting. Both women were arrested. Both pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. And both were sentenced to 5 years to life in prison. A short punishment for a crime that had shattered a life. But even after the trial, even after the sentencing, one question remained. Betty Fabiano. How much had she known? Had she suspected what Joan was capable of? Had she felt the obsessive pull of her former lover turning into something darker? The court never proved she was involved. She never faced charges. But whispers followed her for years. Did she love her husband? Did she grieve? Or did she, in the quiet of the night, wonder what might have happened, if she had never gone back to him? We may never know. Halloween night, 1957. A mask. A gun. A single shot. Not for money. Not for power. But for love. For jealousy. For a twisted obsession that led to murder. Even today, this case remains infamous. A Halloween killing wrapped in mystery, passion, and betrayal. Because sometimes, the scariest thing about Halloween isn't the ghosts. Isn't the monsters. Isn't even the masks. Sometimes, it's the person knocking on your door. Closing thoughts. 3 murders. 3 tragedies. And a single night where masks weren't just costumes, they were shields for something far more sinister. Halloween, a night where we invite the eerie, the unknown, the supernatural into our world. A night where we expect to be scared, but only by things we know aren't real. But what happens when the real horror isn't lurking in the shadows, but standing right at your doorstep? In Los Angeles, a city built on dreams and illusions, Halloween has never been just a holiday. It has been a stage for nightmares to play out in the most terrifying ways. A man murdered at a party, surrounded by people who mistook his death for a joke. An elderly couple answering the door to what should have been harmless trick-or-treaters, only to find death waiting on the other side. And a jealous lover, manipulating a vulnerable woman into committing murder, all wrapped in the disguise of a Halloween prank. Each of these stories started the same. A door opening. A moment of trust. A mask hiding the true face beneath. And each of them ended in blood. Decades have passed. The costumes have changed. The city has evolved. But the ghosts of these crimes still linger. The echoes of gunshots. The unanswered screams. The silent, eerie calm that follows when the real world collides with something unspeakable. Maybe it's just the way Los Angeles works. A place of illusion. A place where things are never quite what they seem. A place where one night a year, anyone can become anything. But beneath the plastic masks and painted faces, one truth remains. The scariest stories aren't the ones we tell around a campfire. They're the ones that actually happened. And sometimes, the real monsters aren't the ones in horror movies. Sometimes, they knock on your door.